Hello, I'm Fraser, and this is The Context.
They're using their own citizens as human shields. We neutralized and shot and tried in every possible way to let their people go.
It does seem as though the Israeli military net around the heavily populated, built-up area of Gaza City is beginning to tighten.
The priority is to get aid into Gaza. Palestinians do not want to leave Gaza. They want aid to come into Gaza, and that should be the priority.
Gaza has become a graveyard for children. It's a living hell for everyone else.
A huge explosion in the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza is reported to have killed dozens of people. Israel Defense Forces have confirmed they were behind the attack, claiming they've successfully taken out a key Hamas commander and the section of Hamas's underground tunnel network. We will keep you across those developments tonight. Also, we'll speak to a former Israeli general about the war aims as tanks and troops make their way deeper into Gaza. We'll hear from the charity Save the Children, who say by their estimates there have been more than 3,000 children killed in this conflict, more than in all the world's conflicts of the past 5 years. And we'll hear from Senator Mike Lee, one of the growing number of Republicans who want Israel funding split from the support for Ukraine. Good evening. So at least 50 people are reported to have been killed and many more injured in a blast at the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. Those figures have come from the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. The French news agency AFP say their reporter has been at the scene and the footage shows at least 47 bodies recovered from the rubble. These pictures show people digging with their hands in what you can see is an enormous crater as they search for survivors, pulling bodies from the rubble. Israel Defense Forces have confirmed they were behind that attack, claiming the strike killed a key Hamas commander. Israel says the strike is part of its wider operation, with IDF forces striking targets in all parts of Gaza overnight, with fierce battles being reported with Hamas near Gaza City. These pictures from the Israel Defense Forces show troops carrying out some of these ground operations. The IDF says it has encountered anti-tank missiles and machine gun fire as they advance into Gaza. We start our coverage tonight with this report from our international editor Jeremy Bowen and a warning: you may find some of his report distressing. Paul, we'll talk to you plenty through the course of the programme. Thank you very much indeed for that. And of course, we will get some reaction from the Israeli side to that enormous blast in Jabalia in the next few minutes. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Let's take a quick look at some of the other stories making headlines today. XL bully dogs will be formally banned in the UK by the new year. Ministers announced the dog will be added, to the list of banned breeds under the Dangerous Dogs Act. XL bully owners have until January to apply for an exemption to keep their pet. If it's granted, they'll have to keep the dog muzzled and on a lead when it's in public. The English Ice Hockey Association says from next year it will be mandatory for players to wear neck guards. The announcement was made following the sad death of American ice hockey player Adam Johnson. His neck was cut by a skate blade during a game in Sheffield on Saturday. Police are investigating. Assisted dying on the Isle of Man could move a step closer as draft legislation is debated in Parliament. The plans would see residents with a terminal illness and no more than 6 months to live given the right to end their lives with help. You're live with BBC News. Israel said its attack on Jabalia today destroyed some of the underground infrastructure used by Hamas. As Israel steps up its offensive, it is continuing to target those tunnels and bunkers. Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera takes a closer look now at that underground network and why it is so important to Israel to destroy it. Yeah, I'm sorry to squeeze you this evening, Mr. Altman. It's very good of you to come on the programme. We will get some reaction to that the other side of the break. We're going to hear from Senator Mike Lee, one of those who's opposed to more Ukraine funding. Stay with us.
Whether you're in Washington, Wisconsin, or even back in the UK,
we take you behind the scenes, explaining US news, culture, and the era-defining presidential election.
Americast, a BBC News podcast untangling America. Listen weekly on BBC Sounds.
Hello, I'm Christian Fraser. You're watching The Context on BBC News. President Biden is trying to push a $105 billion aid spending package through Congress, which would give more assistance to Ukraine and Israel. We'll speak to a Republican senator about why he's against it. But before we do that, let's get a check on the sport. Here's Mark Edwards.
Thanks, Christian. We're going to start with football. And Saudi Arabia is set to host the men's 2034 World Cup after Australia opted against mounting a rival bid. The decision was confirmed only hours before FIFA's deadline for declarations of interest on Tuesday. And that's all sport for now. Back to you, Christian.
Mark, thank you very much. So let's go back to the politics in Washington and the row that's brewing over this foreign aid. There is a $105 billion spending package the White House has sent to Congress. Included in that is more than $44 billion for Ukraine and $10 billion for Israel. The sweetener is the money the administration included for tighter security at the southern border. Trouble is, hardline Republicans in both the House and the Senate want to vote on the bill's constituent parts. They want to separate Israel spending from the rest and vote on Israel first. And what's more, the new Speaker in the Republican-led House wants Israel funding to be financed by budget cuts to the IRS, a non-starter for the Democrat-led Senate. So here we are again. A standoff in Congress, split government, reluctance to compromise, all of which puts American interests on the line. I've been getting reaction to that from the Republican Senator Mike Lee, who's been attending a conference here in London, starting with his position on the calls for humanitarian pauses in Gaza. Not a voice we often hear on the context, but really important to get a flavour of the direction of travel within the Republican Party and what they think about Ukraine funding, because of course it matters. And as Senator Lee said, there are a growing number of people who think like him in America right now about funding the war in Ukraine. We'll perhaps get some reaction to that with our panel later in the programme. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.
BBC News, bringing you different stories from across the UK.
It is this to the net.
You're live with BBC News. Amid those terrible scenes we've witnessed from the Jabalia refugee camp this afternoon, more small body bags. Children make up half the population of Gaza. The Hamas-led health ministry claims that among more than 8,000 people killed, there are around 3,400 children. James, I wish we could talk more about it, but we're out of time. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Maybe we'll talk more about the fate of the children in Gaza. Just a word, if you're watching in the UK, don't go away. Because of the clock change, things are a little different here in this week. We're going to say a quick goodbye to our viewers around the world. They'll have World News America up next, but we'll be staying with you, so don't go far. The official inquiry into the COVID pandemic has been told that former Prime Minister Boris Johnson had suggested the pandemic was nature's way of dealing with old people. Sir Patrick Vallance, the government's former chief scientific advisor, made those comments in his diary on the 14th of December 2020. The following day, Sir Patrick wrote that the then Conservative chief whip, Mark Spencer, said, "I think we should let the old people get it and protect others." Mr Johnson reportedly backed this statement, according to Sir Patrick, allegedly responding, "A lot of my backbenchers think that, and I must say, I agree with them." One of the then Prime Minister's closest aides, Dominic Cummings, told the inquiry that the government at that time had been totally dysfunctional. Our political editor, Chris Mason, was watching the evidence. We will talk plenty more about the COVID inquiry in the second part of our programme. Our panel coming up tonight no doubt have some thoughts on that. Just a line to bring you, actually, line of breaking news. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading back to the Middle East on Friday. He'll be in Israel on Friday, where he'll have meetings with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Of course, the White House leaning on the Israelis today to try and get more aid into Gaza, and the King of Jordan telling Joe Biden on a phone call today that there needs to be a pause, a humanitarian pause, so they can get more of those trucks in. So maybe we'll pick up some of that with our panel over the course of the next hour. We are going to go to a short break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Hello there. The rain in Northern Ireland has eased, but in 24 hours in County Down, there was 3 inches of rain, which together with Northern Ireland, the temperature's 10 to 12 degrees. The winds start to ease down later in the day in the southwest as the storm drifts away and weakens, heading up into the North Sea in time for Friday. So things are not looking quite so bad on Friday. It's not going to be as windy. It's not going to be as wet. There'll be some sunshine and some showers, maybe some wetter, windier weather returning to eastern parts of Scotland and later into the northeast of England.
Your favourite radio show is now available on BBC News, so join me, Nikki Campbell, for the nation's phone-in, talking about the big topics of the day, giving you a voice. No judgment, just honesty. Nikki Campbell. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Hello, I'm Christian Fraser, and this is The Context.
They're using their own citizens as human shields. We neutralized and shot and tried in every possible way to let their people go.
It does seem as though the Israeli military net around the heavily populated, built-up area of Gaza City is beginning to tighten.
The priority is to get aid into Gaza. Palestinians do not want to leave Gaza. They want aid to come into Gaza, and that should be the priority.
Gaza has become a graveyard for children. It's a living hell for everyone else.
BBC Verify has geolocated the precise spot of that enormous explosion in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, in which Hamas says dozens of Palestinians were killed. We'll get reaction tonight to that and the calls for a ceasefire. Now is not the time, says Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer, who, in spite of the loud protests within his party, is backing Israel's response. Not an easy time, though, for America's Jewish community, with anti-Semitism on the rise at colleges and universities. With us tonight to discuss the fallout from the war, the former advisor to President Obama's State Department, Joel Rubin, and the deputy comment editor at The Telegraph, Annabel Denham. Maybe we'll get her thoughts as well on Dominic Cummings' evidence to the COVID inquiry today. It was pretty insane, he said, that the then Prime Minister and other officials took February half-term in 2020 as the virus went rampant. A very good evening. Jabalia is the largest of the Gaza Strip's 8 refugee camps and the most densely populated. Before the war, there were 116,000 people living in just 1.5 square kilometres. It's no longer populated with tents. It is full of high tenement blocks occupied by people who were driven from their homes after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Earlier this month, the order was given to evacuate. But it is estimated there are still some 300,000 people living in the northern sector, and they are trapped between the incoming Israeli army and the Hamas fighters who are dug in around this tight warren of streets. Tonight we have reports that dozens of people may have been killed in an enormous blast that has left this gigantic crater. The French news agency AFP has been at the scene. The agency says footage shows at least 47 bodies recovered from the rubble. A spokesman for the Israeli army has confirmed they were behind the attack and were targeting a senior Hamas commander who they've taken out. Well, the top 2 members of President Biden's cabinet, the Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin, were on the Hill this afternoon calling on senators to back the president's foreign aid package. That tops $105 billion. Included in that is the aid for both Israel and Ukraine, money for the US southern border and support for Taiwan. But at one point during that session, the committee was interrupted by peace protesters. Yeah, emotions running high. there is broad bipartisan support for the aid package. The trouble for the White House is that the new House Speaker Mike Johnson favours splitting it all up. He wants Ukraine funding separated from support for Israel, and in return for that Israel funding, he wants the $14 billion to be stripped out of the budget for the tax office, the IRS, which cracks down on tax cheats. It's a non-starter for the Democrat majority in the Senate, so it will go nowhere. But it could threaten to delay both Israel and Ukraine funding at a critical moment. One of the Republican senators who supports separating the spending is Utah Senator Mike Lee, who spoke to us earlier. Senator Mike Lee speaking to us a little earlier. Joel Rubin, there are certainly issues within the Republican Party about spending and how this package is put together, and it is certainly within the Republican caucus that debate will take place. But he is right in one thing when it comes to Ukraine funding, and that is that the White House has not made a good enough case to the American people as to why Ukraine funding is so important. Yeah.
Christian, that's exactly the message that Mitch McConnell is saying. The Republicans should listen to that message. It's good for the United States to support Ukraine.
Well, it's the point General Mark Milley makes that if Russia were to retool and to go again, they would have to double the defence budget. So it's a false economy, in his view, to cut Ukraine spending. Listen, I want to talk about the impact it's having domestically, this war in the Middle East. The FBI had just been alerted after death threats were made against Jewish students at one of the United States' most prestigious universities. The anti-Semitic posts calling for violence against Jewish students at Cornell University in New York were published on a forum for members of the institution's fraternities this weekend. Cornell has more Jewish students than any other Ivy League university. That's around 2,500. One post read, "If you see a Jewish person on campus, follow them home and slit their throats." Here's the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, who himself is from New York. Let's talk about it here, Annabelle. The current conflict in the Middle East has created plenty of conflict within Labour ranks. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, sticking to his position today, defying more than a dozen of his frontbenchers who want him to call for a ceasefire. In a speech at Chatham House in central London, he acknowledged the rising temperature on British streets. In fact, he needed only to look outside where protesters were waving Palestinian flags. But Sir Keir said a permanent ceasefire in Gaza was not currently the solution to the conflict. There is huge anger on the hard left that Sir Keir has suspended Andy MacDonald, the MP from Middlesbrough, after he made reference to a chant that Joel just talked about, perceived by many to be anti-Semitic while attending a recent pro-Palestinian rally. Annabelle, he did qualify it in the sense that he said he wanted Israel and Palestinians to be living in that region peacefully together, which is not how others have used that term between the river and the sea. But you've just heard from Joel how offensive it is to the Jewish community, that term, and how it affects them. So was Sir Keir right to suspend Andy MacDonald? Well, you can't swap us Donald Trump for Boris Johnson because Donald Trump is running for office again. And wherever he goes on the campaign trail, Donald Trump is forever mocking 80-year-old Joe Biden as feeble and no longer up to the job, which some might say is a bit rich because these past few weeks, the former president himself has looked a little confused. In fact, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is still trying to eat into Trump's big polling lead, has launched a Trump accident tracker. Here's a flavour. My favourite. Right, let's move on. It's time for the panel. Annabelle, we're going to start with you, ladies first. We're going to talk about a story that really interests me, and that is ticket officers, which they were going to do away with. The Railway Delivery Group were going to do away with ticket officers on all our stations. But then the passenger groups went away and interviewed a lot of people. I mean, 750,000 people, and 99% of them want ticket officers to remain. So they've U-turned. All right, we're out of time.
It is good news for America.
It's very good news. Very good news. If you're a Kansas City fan and also a Swiftie, it's great news. Listen, great to have your company. Annabelle, Joel, thank you so much. We will be back same time tomorrow. I do hope you'll join us for that. Have a very good evening. Good night.
Hello, I'm Mark Edwards with your sport. We're going to start with the Women's Nations League, and it's been a disappointing night for Serena Wiedmann's World Cup runners-up. The Lionesses losing